Our lecture tonight is not just our final theology conference lecture, but it is also our annual McManus Lecture. The McManus Lecture brings to campus each year a distinguished scholar in the humanities to address specific topics of theological and philosophical importance, and it provides faculty, students, and our guests with the opportunity firsthand to interact with the highest level of scholarship. So we're thrilled to have as our McManus lecturer and final lecturer of the conference, Dr. Philip Jenkins. Dr. Philip Jenkins is the Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor University. It's a little warmer at Baylor than it is here right now. And as many of you know, he's written a number of notable books, including Laying Down the Sword, The Next Christendom, and he's very excited to be with us. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Jenkins.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be at Wheaton. My topic tonight is the image of God in global faith. And I want to begin by a quote from St. John of Damascus we've heard about in this conference. About 7:30, he wrote this: "Every image is a revelation and representation of something hidden. For instance, man has not a clear knowledge of what is invisible, the spirit being veiled to the body, nor of future things, nor of things apart and distant, because he is circumscribed by place and time." And I just want to look at those closing words. In forming an image that you are circumscribed by place and time. Or put another way, you are limited by your culture. And for example, we talk about the Great Commission. We talk about the idea of going to preach the gospel, the fact that you are made in the image of God. But we run into a problem, because how I conceive the image of God is not necessarily how you are going to conceive the image of God. How shall we preach the Lord's image in a strange land? That has always been something of an issue, but it's much more so in modern times when, as has been said, Christianity is globalizing so much. I don't know if you saw the Pew report just recently that was projecting by the mid-century something like 40% of the world's Christians would be in Africa. That's a little bit higher than my figure, which is about 33%. But you have a choice. You can believe the Pew figures, you can believe the correct figures. Either is fine. So we're dealing with a very different kind of Christianity emerging, where you cannot assume so many of the traditional ideas. The reason this is so important is it gets to a fundamental lesson in the history of theology, which is the role played by the contact between Christianity and other religions with which it is in contact, and it has always been in contact with other religions, whether we're talking about Platonism and Greek philosophical systems, whether we're talking about Asian religions, Islam, at various periods in history. What we see through the history of theology is a pattern that goes like this. Christianity encounters other religions, formulates its ideas of God, of the image of God, in contact with those, and those ideas then bleed back to the mainstream. And the reason perhaps we are not so familiar with that process is those ideas become so obvious and so mainstream that it's incredible that they could have ever been anything else. So what is originally formed on the frontier becomes normal. Lamin Sanneh has a great quote that I like, which is, he always says, the original language of Christianity is translation. It's a famous phrase. I always suggest that the original dialect of theology is border crossing. Theology is born on borders. What I'd like to do, just to illustrate this, I'd like to take a couple of historical examples. And I want to take one moment in Christian history. not necessarily the best known, but just one where you have a number of things happening all together. And I want to look at 4 incidents that happened within about 20 years of each other. And theoretically, one person, one extremely widely traveled person, could have crossed the whole world and dealt with and participated in each and every one of these different moments of encounter, all of which in their different ways revolve around a different sense of the image of God, of how we imagine God, of how we imagine human beings as representing that image. I take a period between about 780 and 800 AD. And the reason I take that is because that is the date, 781, of one of the great Christian monuments, the so-called Nestorian stone that was erected by the Church of the East in China, that commemorated the foundation of the Christian mission in China. It was set up by a bishop called Adam, who has a great story in his own right. But if you read this, that was discovered in the 16th century, for some hundreds of years, it was so Asian in its character, so Asian in its sense of God and his image, that people debated for a long time whether they were dealing with a Christian source, a Buddhist source, a Taoist source. It had become completely Chinese in character. And now there's absolutely no doubt that it was very much Christian, but it was the sense of the image of God created by a church, the symbol of which was a combined cross and lotus, and which in its day, by the way, was briefly the largest church in the world, considerably bigger than the Roman Catholic Church. Behold the unchangeably true and invisible, who existed through all eternity without origin, the far-seeing perfect intelligence, whose mysterious existence is everlasting. Operating on primordial substance, he created the universe, being more excellent than all holy intelligences, inasmuch as he is the source of all that is honorable. And so on. I'm using a rather old translation here, which sort of exaggerates the stereotypically Chinese character of the language. But my point is, for this great church that created this monument, the image of God is one basically identical to that of the world's greatest ruler at the time, who was the Chinese emperor. And in fact, when we read their accounts of God in his heavenly court, he is surrounded by angels, by asuras, and by devas. Very much Asian themes. That's one image of God. Well, I said several things were happening at this time in the West. Christianity is in contact, very much so, with Islam. And I'm going to say something which is guaranteed to annoy all theologians. Tell me who the conversation partners of Christianity are. Tell me who the interlocutors are. And I will tell you what directions the theological developments are going to take. Christianity never has, is not, and never will be something that operates in a vacuum. It always operates in dialogue, often multiple dialogues. One part of the church is in dialogue with Asian religions. In the Byzantine Empire, of course, they're in dialogue with Islam, and many people within the empire in the 8th century are very nervous about the constant Islamic attacks on the idea of the visual representation of Christ, of the saints, of the divine. You get the great movement, which a phrase we've heard in this conference, iconoclasm, image breaking, a condemnation of any idea that you could represent the divine in material form. That movement, by the way, has an interesting name. In Greek, it's called the ikonomachia, which is the icon struggle. But historians sometimes call it, and I love this phrase, the Byzantine Reformation. Really. If anyone shall endeavor to represent the forms of the saints in lifeless pictures with material colors, which are of no value, and does not rather represent their virtues as living images in himself, let him be anathema. The great opponent of that idea, by the way, this was a very bloody movement, the great opponent of that idea was John of Damascus, and John of Damascus could write anything he wanted because he lived under a Muslim regime which was really tolerant. So he could write wonderful Christian theology on anything he wanted. And he did various things. He, for instance, invented popularized the famous distinction between different types of worship. Latria, true worship, which is that accorded to God alone, and dulia, proskynesis, veneration, which you accord to lesser spiritual realities such as saints. And he also created probably the best ever defense of images in religion. Were this a Catholic conference, St. John of Damascus would be the patron saint of this conference. I do not worship matter, he said. I worship the God of matter, who became matter for my sake, and deigned to inhabit matter, who worked out my salvation through matter. I venerate matter, though not as God. How could God be born out of lifeless things? He says, matter has saved us. Was not the thrice blessed word of the cross matter? Was not the sacred mountain of Calvary matter? Is not the most holy book of the Gospels matter? It's kind of an interesting idea, because at once it's venerating the book as a material object and an image of truth, and also the words and images it contains. It's a kind of a mixed image. In 787, which is the reason I choose the date, a second Council of Nicaea, why did they choose the place, formally proclaimed the veneration, not the worship, of icons. Well, the icon controversy had a huge impact in the West in convincing Latin Catholic rulers like Charlemagne that you couldn't trust Greeks, and that they were a bunch of heretics and they could go whichever way they wanted. And it's at this point, around about this time, that the Western Church does something which is incredibly bold, which is one of the oldest Christian documents, is the Creed. You have the Apostles' Creed, you have the Nicene Creed. And these words, the words of these creeds are sacred and untouchable, unless, of course, they're inconvenient, in which case you change them. And it's round about this time that Charlemagne's empire changes the creed. If you say the creed, it's the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and they put in like an arrow there saying, oh yeah, and the Son, much to the horror of the Byzantines, who basically still haven't forgiven them. Where does that come from? Easy. In the 6th and 7th centuries, churches around the empire have to deal with Arians, that is, people who deny the full divinity of Christ. So they change the creed to say, yes, Christ is really fully God and equal to the Father, and we're going to change the creed. And what's happening there is kind of interesting. And this is something we're going to see very much in the modern world. Lots of independent, autonomous action by local churches that are dealing with local pastoral issues, local controversies, and do not care a whit about what head office says. They're doing it to deal with immediate realities on the ground. And in the 8th century, round about the year 790, Charlemagne approves that, and almost immediately after, 300 years after, the papacy says, okay, that's a technical theological. If you must, and we've all said it ever since. One final one. In Spain, you have Catholics who are dealing with Muslims who are under great threat. The Catholics are under great threat. And again, they have to deal with Muslims who just do not understand Christian ideas of the image of God and cannot accept this idea of Christ as the full reality of God. And it's in that era, they're under so many challenges. 786, for example, is when the great mosque at Cordoba is begun. Local Spanish churches have to deal with this. And they respond with creating a form of adoptionism, an adoptionist heresy, which, a little bit less than the ancient heresies, puts Christ just that little bit below God the Father. So in the space of 20 years, long story short, in the space of 20 years, you have different frontiers around the world, and I can give you plenty more, where Christian theology is being formed, is being forged in the crucible of daily encounters with other religions. And those influences are then feeding back to the mainstream, so that in every Catholic church, every Anglican, Lutheran, Episcopal church in America, they say the Father proceeds from the Father and the Son, and don't even realize what a departure this is. It's what happens on the frontier that counts. As cultures change, so do images of God. Images of God change over time. Again, many examples, not one that's from a border encounter, but we're all familiar with the Western theory of the atonement, which was formulated by Anselm around about the year 1100. And if the old Chinese church had imagined God as a Chinese emperor, Anselm's atonement theory is a very, very feudal theory. It imagines God as basically a feudal overlord. Our sins insult him, deprive him of honor in a way that can only be dealt with by ransom. And again, a theory which is quite a departure from earliest theories, and Orthodox theologians regard it as very legalistic. But it's a great example of how the biblical Lord, Adonai Elohim, becomes a feudal lord. Images change. Well, so that's by way of, of background here. But so much of what we're seeing in the modern world represents similar kinds of accommodation. In some cases, maybe syncretism, but accommodating to a different world. And I just want to tell a story of how I became interested in this particular one as a topic through a radically unlikely source. Everyone here has heard of the Inklings. Everyone here has heard of that band of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Owen Barfield and the others, and also the one who C.S. Lewis regarded as the bright one of the group, who was Charles Williams. And Charles Williams, by the way, I have a complaint. Why isn't this whole thing about Charles Williams? He probably wrote more about affirmation and negation of images than the vast majority of modern theologians. He also did a lot of plays and novels. And one of his oddest, and it's not just the title is The House of the Octopus. Now there's a movie you might go see, maybe. And you'd be surprised by what you'd get. Is an absolutely brilliant example of contemporary Global South theology from a 1940s bookish Oxford Anglican. And let me explain why. Williams was obsessed with this idea of images and images of God. I can pretty much guarantee you don't know the play. If you read it, you'll be amazed. It's about a missionary on a South Sea island, and that island is being invaded by an evil empire. Think of the Japanese in World War II. And one of his converts is a woman called Alayu, a young woman recently converted to the faith. And the evil invaders say, "Will you give up your faith and we'll let you live?" And she abandons her faith and she becomes an apostate, and they kill her anyway. And as he knows, well, I'm afraid in her last moments, she abandoned the faith, she abandoned Christ, she is lost forever. And the people all say, "Well, no, you're totally wrong there, she's saved." Why? Because human beings are the image of God, and they only exist in community. How can you have an individual as the image of God? Point one. We in these isles live in our people, no man's life his own, from birth and initiation. When our salvation came to us, it showed us no new mode, sir, dare you say so, of living to ourselves. The church is not many, but the life of many in ways of relation. If a community is saved, she is saved, and also, she in that moment rejected God, but at other moments, notably her baptism, she didn't. God exists outside time and can overrule time. Elihu is the image of God, and so can she. And in the play, Elihu is clearly redeemed after death as a martyr and a saint. And she is then to redeem the missionary priest as he faces his martyrdom. Interesting set of ideas from a play which baffled audiences when it came out. But from the point of view, reading it today in the light of African theology, this was written when? It's a very remarkable, it's a remarkable piece. Well, I've talked about briefly about the idea of in 1945, the idea of a global church was perhaps not something easily envisaged, but since then it's obviously become I suppose, a dominant reality in Christianity. I could spend the rest of my time giving you numbers and factoids on that, but I suppose I'll give you one, which is in 1900, there were 10 million Christians in Africa, representing, about something like 1.5% of the world's Christians. By 2050, there'll be somewhat over 1 billion Christians in Africa, representing somewhat over a third. Now, that's a change. And some denominations have been hit much more than others. What is also important is most of these newer Christian communities came from backgrounds without any particular familiarity with Christianity or monotheist religion. How did you determine the proper interaction between old and new, between the older pagan animist systems and Christianity? And modern theologians have spent a lot of time trying to decide how far older images of God can be taken over and can apply. And the way they actually use this language of image is very interesting. This is from a Catholic archbishop in Africa, in Namibia. Our Namibian African people have accepted Christ, but this Christ walks too much among them in a European garment. Hence, you have the obsession with what's been termed inculturation. And you have names like Kwame Bediako, John Mbiti, Biang Kato. All have tried to put the Bible, the whole idea of the image of God in African or Asian traditions, to permit believers to come to terms with God in their own particular way. And some of these efforts at enculturation, I would say, have been they've been forced, they've been artificial, when they've been imposed from above. Where they have been successful is where they have arisen from below. And really, there are three areas where you can tell when enculturation is working. It's not necessarily of saying we reject this idea of God as a white colonial God. But God dwells among us when we see three things. One is when you see local, native prophets speaking for God, often in a way that the older churches do not understand, will not permit. But that is the moment, I suggest to you, when missions have succeeded most, because that's the moment when you get the move to autonomous native churches. By the way, one of the phrases I I always like in this way. One of the founders of the English missionary movement once said, very, very historically, that back in 1843, that the goal of his mission, the goal of mission, was, quote, the euthanasia of mission. In other words, we want to kill mission and build churches. And you know that churches are emerging when three things happen. One is the appearance of native prophets. The other is putting the word into the local language. And the other one is the idea of sacred space. And in some ways, I'm departing from what I suppose a couple of other people have said in this conference, because I'm emphasizing some of maybe the senses of localization, almost like of a sacramental quality, of the idea of God is in this place. Because images go beyond the idea of visual images. Images are in words. Images are in place. And you can tell when people are accepting these ideas. Again, I refer to the work of Lamin Sanneh, talking about the importance of translation. When ordinary people think of the image of God, they're as likely to think of it as being in a place, as in a person. The one perhaps necessarily implies the other. Localization implies nativization. And you know, that's something that we see in not just in Africa and Asia, but in Western cultures too. If you ever read the work of sort of English mystics or European mystics, they often try and bring the idea of holiness, the holy city, back home. William Blake, for example, that great mystic, once wrote his poem Jerusalem, which is an unofficial national anthem of England. And it glorifies the city of Jerusalem where the Lamb is, and the city is also in London. The fields from Islington to Marylebone, from Primrose Hill to St. John's Wood, were builded o'er with pillars of gold, and there Jerusalem's pillars stood. That was about 1800. 30 years later, Joseph Smith gazed out over the fields of western New York and saw their clashing ancient Hebrew armies. It's a common pattern to see the Holy Land under our feet. One of the great developments in African Christianity in the last 40 years has been the creation of sacred Christian landscapes, which have become pilgrimage shrines. Not very well known in the West as yet. But if you think of the world's great holy places, you wouldn't think of a place in South Africa like Ekufakameni, and which is sacred to the Nazarite Baptist Church. And you say, well, okay, it's a Baptist church. How big can it be? At Easter, there are 3 times as many people at Ekufakameni as in Rome. There are more there than in Mecca. I remember Ekufakameni, where the springs are, springs of living water lasting forever. In its time, it'll probably become as great a Christian shrine as Lourdes or Rome, and a landscape is appearing before our eyes. I also want to venture into another kind of controversial area. We've talked about the image of God. God has a female face. And the reason this is a little controversial is we see this so much in the way in which different peoples, when they accept particular forms of Christianity, domesticate and put in their own language images of the Virgin Mary. Now, if you are a good Catholic, you will be standing up at this point and saying, now wait a moment. Christians do not worship the Virgin Mary. That is latria. They give her respect, veneration, proskynesis. Have you never read John of Damascus? And I say, well, yes. But if you go to a religious procession in the Philippines or in Mexico or in the Congo, and you look at the treatment of the Virgin Mary, and you talk to people and try and work out what they're doing, if you can come up with a word short of worship, you are a better theologian than I am. It's de facto worship. And what we've seen, if you want to look at the domestication of images of God, the proliferation of images of God, look at these female images. Each country, each culture has its own particular version. There's a very good reason for this. You look, for instance, at Mexico's sacred figure, the Virgin of Guadalupe. You look at Peru's the Virgin of El Quinche. You look at Cuba's Virgin of Caridad del Cobre. And they all have something in common. They look like local people. They are brown-skinned. In fact, the common name for these virgin figures is La Morenita, little darky, little dark one. And the love, the identification with these figures is quite remarkable. And I suggest they're seeing a female face of God. You know, there's a famous story about a Protestant preacher in a Mexican village, and he goes in and wants to talk about, you know, the priests. They're greedy. They're just deceiving you. You can't trust them. Yeah. Catholic Church, you can't trust them. Oh, no. And that Virgin of Guadalupe, she's a fake. And they ran him out of town on a rail. Point me to a country with a Catholic presence that has emerged in the last couple of hundred years. And you know when they have accepted that particular image of God because she emerges in female form. Go to somewhere like, if you ever want to see a mind-boggling place there, go to southern India, go to Tamil Nadu, which is the center, by the way, of one of the great shrines of the Virgin Mary in the world, which is a little counterintuitive, at a place called Vailankani, which attracts throngs in their millions of Christians and Hindus and Muslims, and nobody particularly bothers. And Vailankani is imagined, it is the Virgin Mary, but conceived in purely Indian terms. And the reason this is a direction for the future, if you look at adult baptisms around the world, there were more, any baptisms in the world. If you look, there were more Catholic baptisms last year in the Philippines than in France, Spain, Italy, and Poland combined. There are a great many black and brown Catholics, and so much of their vision of the divine is a female vision. Images of God that emerge in the new Christianities also differ from the older world in some other ways. You know, when I talk about Catholics, I always like to draw a distinction between newer Catholics and older stock Catholics in the US, who I always like to call, in the common parlance, Anglo. I love telling Irish people they're Anglo. It drives them crazy. As God became Nigerian or Brazilian or Indian, he was imagined differently according to the needs of his followers. Relatively comfortable Europeans, North Americans did not need God for so many basic functions of life, for so many functions of health. God became a God of the gaps, the things that you could not explain, the things that where God had to be slotted in as an extra. Now imagine conceiving of God in a society where you cannot take any of that for granted, where you cannot take health for granted. I suggest, in fact, that the modern Christian world that is emerging worldwide is returning to a kind of Christian reality that we saw through the early and the medieval church, where a primary function of the church is that of healing. Healing perceived very broadly. Healing not just in body, but in mind, in soul, in spirit, and society. And you look at the images of God that become so common, and so often it is God as healer. The other one, which gets addressed perhaps a lot less, is that of God as ancestor. And I take us back to that great African prophet, Charles Williams, who'd be awfully surprised to be so regarded. of it being inconceivable to imagine salvation of individuals. As we look at different societies around the world, can I suggest how extremely, historically rare it is to have anything like the radical individualism that is so prevalent in the West? Something that detaches salvation from families, from communities, from nations. And I say once again, I think that was one of Williams's great insights. For example, this is one example from a recent attempt at a Catholic Eucharistic prayer of enculturation. O Father, great ancestor, we lack adequate words to thank you, great ancestor who lives on the brilliant mountains. O Father, Father of our ancestors, we are gathered to praise you and to thank you with our sacrifice. The more God is needed, the more powerful and dominant his image as a necessity of daily life. And one thing which interests me is, as people try and formulate these images, what resources do they have to turn to? Well, the Bible is a nearly infinite source. But I'm remembering one story of one of the prevalent heresies in the 8th century, back to my 8th century. Here's an interesting situation. Imagine yourself in the position of having to go to a people that is absolutely immersed in this idea of community and kin and clan, and saying, we want you to be saved. What happens to my ancestors? Oh, they're all in hell. Well, there's a certain flexibility in preaching. They try presenting hell differently. The famous example of this, of course, is when the early missionaries go to Iceland and say, if you're bad, you'll end up in a dreadful place called hell, where a fire burns all the time. And the local people say, it's warm. And Iceland is actually the only part of the Christian world where hell is conceived as really, really cold. But some of those missionaries on the front lines develop a strategy which is brilliant. And they use a very ancient Christian story, which is that of the harrowing of hell, which is a story from a pseudo-gospel. And it says that Christ dies on Friday, he's resurrected on Sunday. What's he doing in between? And they use a number of New Testament hints. And in the 5th century, there's a story called The Harrowing of Hell, which describes Christ's military conquest and enormous hostage rescue. He goes to hell and rescues the righteous dead who died before his time. And what some people are doing in 8th century Europe is saying, well, of course, your ancestors would be in hell, or they would have been in hell, but Christ got them out. Here's a challenge for you. So much of this panel has been about the idea of the individual as the image of God. Can I suggest maybe we need to think in somewhat more communal terms in that way, or think of some of the problems that arise there? Having said that individualism is such a major contribution. It is one of the major contributions of Christianity to culture through history. And you can see the idea of I am in God's image. You can see that as having a remarkable effect in many churches, in basically turning the world upside down. Whether it means that I have to believe that all my parents or my grandparents are in hell, we can discuss. That's a different one. But if you want to see this in operation, I point you to one case study, which is in India. And you look at one of the world's largest examples of continuing structural injustice, which is that of the Dalit people, the people of no caste, previously known as the untouchables, who were given the slightly more euphemistic name of Dalits, those who are crushed, those who are pressed down. Not a story which frequently occurs in our discussions of world events. 200 million people, a vast issue. People who are treated systematically far worse than African Americans were treated during the absolute worst years of segregation. And people who are taught that they have absolutely no worth or dignity, who are equivalent to animals. And then discover through the Bible that they have individual worth. By the way, can you imagine what it must be like when they read or hear very often orally the New Testament, and how they read about Jesus? What an amazing man, clearly a high caste Jew who is not afraid to talk to anyone and, fasten your seatbelts, eats with anyone. In many cultures around the world, one of the absolute stark divisions as to who you can and cannot regard as a human being, whether or not you eat with them. He eats with anyone. What is this? He talks to a woman at a well. In our village, what would happen is the woman would be killed. And they're taught this idea of being not one of the failures of the whole system of caste and karma and rebirth, but I am an individual. And I have all these Old Testament passages denying the impact of what one generation does on what later generations do. You have heard it said, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. That law no longer applies. What I say to you now is, what a man does, for that sin he shall die. You'll be punished for your own deeds, not for that of ancestors. Can you imagine how revolutionary that idea is? And it's about the image of God. There's a Dalit theologian by the name of Satyanand Clark, and he tells a story about a sermon which sort of went radically wrong. And he's talking to a Dalit audience, and he's denouncing them for the way they make the Bible a talisman. So you have a Bible, where do you keep it? Well, obviously I put it under my son's pillow at night to keep him safe. Now what you have to do with this Bible, you have to realize, he said, this is just a book. Look, this is just a material thing. And he throws it on the floor. And everyone in the room, and never mind what he's saying, their eyes are absolutely focused on the Bible on the floor. And afterwards he says, what was so wrong with what I did? But that's the source of all our human rights. That's what gives us dignity. We were afraid you might kick it or trip over it. Is that a superstitious attitude? Probably. But how many people do you know who would say flat out, well, the Bible is the source of all our human rights? It might not be the first time in history where what you see in the realizations, the insights of new churches reproduces the experience of the earliest church. One of my little complaints is that in the United States especially, many people have read very widely in the works of people who write about global Christianity. But there's one person who they always leave out, and that is Andrew Walls. And they know Andrew Walls' name, but unless you realize what he wrote and when he wrote it, which is before any of the rest of us by decades, you don't realize just how important and how revolutionary he is. And his basic point was when he was working in Africa in the 1950s, He is in a small mission college teaching, pontificating, he says, about the 2nd century. Well, all around him, people are living the 2nd century. And eventually, well, he has actually said, if you want to see the Christian church of the 2nd century, you can invent a time machine or buy an air ticket to Africa. And what he's looking at is ideas like this one about the image of God. That you have people who are slaves, who are oppressed, who have no meaning, who do not exist in the mainstream society, and yet are suddenly given this worth, as Beth Jones was discussing today. So the images of hope are very strong. There's also a phrase which I love from one of the great sociologists of religion, David Martin. David Martin talks about, around the world, he looks at Pentecostal churches in Latin America and Africa, and he takes people who basically did not exist in the old society, were never allowed to speak because they were not real people, they were not authentic human beings. And suddenly in these churches, very tentative, they stand up because they speak up, they speak out loud. Women, the very young, the very old. Just look at any moment in an American evangelical revival in the 18th century. You know what I'm talking about. And in the churches, they've acquired, what's the title of his book? Tongues of Fire. And then they take those tongues of fire and they put them into a civil action. Trust me, 5 minutes, not necessary, honest. So I've spoken kind of optimistically about the impact of some of these new concepts of the image of God. If I can just quote Calvin, which is something I never do, he famously warned that man's mind is like a store of idolatry and superstition, so much so that if a man believes his own mind, it's certain he will forsake God and forge some idol in his own brain. We're all expert idol makers. And we have a very bad habit of saying, we're in the image of God, I know just what God looks like, and what he wants is exactly what I wanted to do anyway. And where we see this most perilously, of course, is when people see an image of God, which is an image of a ruthless, militaristic, merciless God, of the crudest possible readings of the Old Testament. And you get a situation like you had in Rwanda, where preachers are basically portraying the minority tribe as Canaanites and Amalekites, and warning what would happen if they failed to carry out God's judgment against them. I suggest this is one sort of area where Western churches do have something to provide. They can talk a lot about their own experiences of idol making, of presenting images of God in an extremely convenient, militaristic, imperialistic mode, and warning people not to reproduce the same mistake. But I suppose I end with a comment and a phrase, and it might be maybe a good one to end this conference. In the 16th century, you had the Reformation, the real one, not the Byzantine one. And one of the main aspects of that was image smashing. Everyone knows that. It wasn't just incidental mob violence. It was a core tenet of the way people imagined God. But one of the most far-reaching moments of that occurred in the Netherlands in 1566, when people basically destroyed everything they could see connected with the old vision of the faith, with stained glass, Catholic medals, any kind of materialistic symbol. If you want a visual image, and one I find unforgettable, there's the famous picture of the Protestant Lord who was sitting on the altar of a Catholic church feeding consecrated hosts to his pet parrot. This incident has a name, which I suggest we need to borrow more into English. It's called the Bildenstorm, or the Storm of Images. And I suggest to you that that is a theme of Christian history throughout. What we always have done, partly because of interactions with other religions, we constantly invent images. Is this really an image-driven age more than any other? I wonder. But we also constantly tear them down. And to quote somebody who probably would be very surprised to be quoted in a sermon in a presentation to Religious College, W.B. Yeats, it's a phrase you know. Civilization is hooped together, brought under a rule, under the semblance of peace by manifold illusion. But man's life is thought, and he, despite his terror, cannot cease ravening through century after century, ravening, raging, and uprooting all that he may come into the desolation of reality. The desolation of reality, the storm of images. I think we're at one stage in the cycle now. We're at the stage of creating and proliferating images, but the one will follow the other. In every century, new images are erected and then smashed, sometimes wantonly, sometimes as part of what we can only call creative destruction. Christians surround themselves with images of God and will continue to do so. But as long as they're Christians, they will always live in ages of transformation, in ever new storms of images. Thank you. And we do questions, remembering that I'm being dazzled by these lights, and I'm prepared to answer any questions you have and under the interrogator's blaze here. So we got... Hello.
Jenkins. You talked about in the, I think we are mainly focusing on the 8th century, where there are very local controversies, and they didn't care about what the effect was for the Church Universal or what headquarters thought of it. Can you talk about that in relationship to today, when our world's so much more interconnected in terms of media and travel, when you have very different local contexts? For example, Anglicans with an Islamic frontier in Nigeria versus Anglicans who are thinking about individualistic, materialistic, tolerant kind of world in North America or in Europe. And how does that go together when they're fighting local controversies that are opposite kind of goals in different parts of the world?
Right. I'm sort of remembering a character in Douglas Adams, which is in Hitchhiker's Guide. He has this thing called the Babel fish, which removes all obstacles to communications between species and beings, and in so doing becomes the greatest cause of war and bloodshed in history. While it's true that people around the world can communicate very easily, things that can cause problems also spread very easily. So a classic example is if, for example, the Anglican Church in Nigeria wanted to become much more tolerant of gay relationships, they'd have the problem that right next door you have Islamic communities who are not going to make any such concessions and would regard this as a major symbol of Christian hypocrisy. So churches go their own way, and I'm just sort of wondering whether the ideal of universal churches, or at least universally administered churches from some central administration, is something that can continue when everyone knows what's going on somewhere else. One of the things that you learn very rapidly when you do medieval history is that edicts go out from the papacy or from bishops or from church councils and are totally ignored in most places. You shall not read this alternative gospel. Of course you do. And when you move into the modern era, when you move into the era of railways and printing in the 19th century, never mind the modern world, that's when you get a kind of homogeneity that generates far more controversies. So, let me suggest to you that we still have evolution from the borders, but it tends to create more divisions. Which is a large part of what you see within the Anglican division. It also, by the way, constrains some institutions in how far they can come to terms with trends in their own particular areas. The Roman Catholic Church, if it was just paying attention to the United States and Europe, would be a vastly more liberal body than it is. But on gender matters, sexual matters, it has to pay attention to its believers in Africa and Asia. And 2030 is the date at which there are more Catholics in Africa than in Europe. Biggest problem of the Roman Catholic Church. You can complete this sentence many ways, but one way of doing it is it's 2,000 miles, the Vatican is 2,000 miles too far north. Anyone else? A deathly hush fell upon the hall. Hey.
First, thanks for mentioning Charles Williams. He is a gap, isn't he?
I think so.
And the romantic way of vision to look and be transformed is something I think we need to keep hearing. So my question, I think you've helpfully mentioned that Christianity is always in dialogue, always in combat, or always in some form of exchange. And you've looked at some of the historic ways this has been the case. And I'm wondering how do you see our image of God being shaped right now by the dialogue in, say, the First World? Moral therapeutic deism, materialism. So how do you perceive that?
Sure. One characteristic of a very pluralist society is that many of these debates are going on at the same time. So, yes, there is that debate with science and secularization. But equally, I mean, what are the great changes that are happening in Western countries? You're getting some of those trends, but also major shifts because of encounters with immigration, with globalization arriving on our shores. For instance, I was recently doing a project about the city of Houston, which officially took the palm from Los Angeles for being the nation's most diverse city. It has 100,000 Nigerians. Those 100,000 Nigerians largely are not in terribly good contact with moral therapeutic deism. By the 2040s, the United States is going to be a majority-minority country in which no one ethnic group represents a majority. This does not mean that the rest of the people will have some kind of, quote, a third world, unquote, religious system, but it means that their societies are becoming much more diverse. I also remember one quote from one of Britain's leading megachurch pastors, and like most of the leading megachurch pastors in Britain and in Europe, he is African, he is Nigerian, and he was lamenting the fact that it was so hard to get Christianity across to white British people. And he said, the problem is they will not see it as a God thing, they just see Christianity as a black thing. Did you ever hear of a film called The Empire Strikes Back? So what I'm saying is, no, the trend you're talking about is clearly very, very important, but as in all eras, Christianity is in dialogue with multiple partners simultaneously. So some Christians are in dialogue with Taoists, some are in dialogue with Buddhists. Oh, can I just add one footnote? Do not think I am presenting Christianity as a sponge that is absorbing these influences. It is giving as well as getting. If you know anything about Buddhism, you've heard the phrase Om Mani Padme Hum, okay? It's a famous early sutra. And that famous early sutra almost certainly is heavily influenced by the Gospel of Nicodemus and the harrowing of hell. Early Christian Gospels find their way into the Buddhist world and shape Buddhism, which is something we tend to forget. So, the world's story, the world's religious story, is one of these multiple religious dialogues. But, secularism, I often talk about a secularization myth, that it's never as intense or as widespread or as deep-rooted as we often think it is. Once you get outside the corporate headquarters of denominations in New York City. and other benighted tribal areas. Yes. Anyone else?
Thank you very much for your paper. If European and North American Christianity could be characterized as highly individualist,
These days?
and we have vital African Christianity in New York City, in Houston, as you've documented, and they have a much more perhaps communal or communitarian understanding.
Yeah.
What does that say for European Christianity and North American Christianity? How will we learn from them, or will we maybe resist? And what will it mean for us?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that something like I try never to talk about something like African Christianity, because Africa is enormously diverse. European Christianity includes Scotch Calvinists and Sicilian Catholics. These are very diverse things. There is only one thing that's constant in the history of American religion, and that's change. If you look at the history of that religion, we can learn so much from the impact of successive waves of immigration, some of which leave their strong traces in terms of particular institutions or ideas, some of which then disappear as they merge into the older mainstream. That was the story of the 18th century, the story of the 19th century, the early 20th century, and I'm sure it'll be the story of the 21st century. You constantly get these new syntheses being formed. Both will be transformed in the process. The biggest mistake that I think we collectively are doing today is not so much failing to look at the immigrant churches, it's failing to look at what America's own history can teach us about this. If you're interested in immigrant churches today, you should be reading very hard on the history of American immigrant religion between 1890 and 1925. Because there are so many parallels and so many lessons and warning signs in that historical era. What did Emerson say? The past has baked our loaf. That's our loaf. It's interesting. I work quite a lot on Europe. And I can point to churches which have become very secularized in lots of ways, and many would say they've made a lot of concessions to the secular world. But you look at ordinary religious devotion in Europe today, and what's interesting about it is it's not just very powerful, it's almost medieval. We live today in the golden age of European pilgrimage. Who would have thought that? Far more people go on pilgrimage today per head of population than they have done at least since the Middle Ages. Isn't that strange? That so many new pilgrimage centers have formed. Pilgrimage centers like Santiago, which used to get maybe 100,000 people back in the 1950s in a year, are now getting 3 and 4 million. What I'm suggesting is that there is a quest for belief, for practice, for piety, not necessarily connected with the great churches. And so much of what we see there speaks very easily to some of the global South Christianity. It's based on what? Sacred places, healing, a very material kind of piety. So maybe the people and the elites operate in different worlds. In the United States, I just use Peter Berger's phrase. I won't attempt to steal it for my own on this occasion. Peter Berger has got this great comment about the most religious people in the world are Indians. The least religious people in the world are Swedes. The United States is a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. And then there's my codicil to that, which is in the New York Times, is the newsletter from the Swedish embassy. But you often get a sense that you cannot judge from churches about what ordinary people do and follow. And what ordinary people do and follow in Europe meshes very readily with what a lot of the immigrant churches do. Gentlemen over here, please.
You make the observation that God has a female face.
Yeah.
And I believe that's true but as someone coming from a conservative evangelical background, it's also jarring to hear. How do you respond to churches that take that image so far and begin to pray, "Our Mother who art in heaven"?
You know, that is a book I have dearly wanted to write through these many years, which is, if you ever look at American sectarian religion, the idea of our Father and Mother in heaven goes back very, very early. It goes back to German sectaries in the 17th century. It goes through Christian Science. And though I would not cite him as an example of any kind, David Koresh prayed to Our Father and Mother, which art in heaven. It is such a strong and enduring theme. Our Mother in heaven, it's such a departure from so many of the traditions. And please understand, I'm not trying to say that anyone who imagines the Virgin Mary as a divine figure is in any sense orthodox. I'm just talking about the everyday praxis of these communities in terms of what sort of really is. No, that it's kind of it's beyond controversial, but I'm just saying that de facto it is what a lot of people will think. And I think whichever gentleman here, please.
You mentioned as culture changes, the image of God is also changing. So I want to ask. I'm involved in intercultural. Interfaith dialogue with Muslims in an Arabic-speaking country.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, what aspect of, image of God should be emphasized so that I can have, effective interfaith dialogue with them.
May I ask which countries?
Morocco.
Yeah. Boy, where to start? I would have a very different answer 20 years ago than I would have now, with some of the sweeping extremism around the Arab world, around the Muslim world. I would say that the best theaters for discussion, the best arenas for discussion, are actually in Muslim communities, not so much in Morocco, but in Europe or the United States, where for the first time in history, you can have all the different currents of Islam together in one place, and basically forced by proximity to be in dialogue with Christian communities. If you do have a genuine opportunity for dialogue, there are just so many opportunities, but there's one very, very short answer, and that's the figure of Jesus himself. The veneration for Jesus in the Islamic world is enormous, far beyond the comprehension of most Christians. When the last day comes, it's not Muhammad who will appear in the skies to usher in the last day. It's Jesus. And by the way, the other figure who is equally beloved is the Virgin Mary. But there is so much of the same body of characters of John the Baptist, of Moses, and so on. And there are so many opportunities there for dialogue. But I honestly wonder about focusing on the figure of Jesus. But as I said, a very, very difficult time to do this. And there's also the what not to do, which is both sides ridding themselves of many centuries of prejudices and lunacies and slanders. But the figure of Jesus. So.
Hi, actually, my question was actually, you might have already answered because it related to the female face of God that you were talking about.
Yeah.
I just kind of wanted a clarification. When you were talking about the de facto worship of the Virgin Mary in the Philippines, were you just saying that that's kind of indicative of a trend to view God in a female way, or was it like they were viewing the Virgin Mary as God?
There's always this kind of paradox in sort of Catholic Reformation spirituality. that the Virgin Mary is so central, and if you look at what the priests will say and what the church will say, they're absolutely explicit. We do not worship the Virgin, clear. But in terms of everyday practice, if you were to get even very quite educated people and said, what do you believe about the Virgin? It would be over into the language of worship. And please, when I say that, I'm not trying in any way to impair or impugn the Christian faith of countries like that. You know, God forbid, so to speak. But I'm saying that that is such a strong role. And I will also say that within the Catholic Church itself, as it looks to try and save its position in Europe, notably under Pope Benedict, what they try to do is put far more emphasis on the Virgin. And I would not be amazed to live long enough to see a Vatican Council, which would not be the great sort of liberalizing one that everyone sometimes dreams of, but one that officially elevated the official role of the Virgin Mary even further. And can I emphasize, listen how I'm phrasing this. In popular practice and devotion, you will hear phrases like co-mediatrix and co-salvatrix, co-mediator. Is that official doctrine? No. Is it what a lot of people believe? Yeah, probably. Does that amount to divinity? I don't know. I'm sorry, it's a theological thing. Okay?
Thank you so much for your presentation this evening, and mention of Andrew Walls, who stood here a few years ago. Given the demographic shifts in Christianity that you and Walls have tracked, and also these developments of majority world theology that we're seeing across the globe and within our minority communities that you've both tracked as well, could you reflect for a minute on the implications for us of these theological developments as we do our reading, as we develop our curriculums at Baylor, here at Wheaton, as we engage as a church? Are the majority world developments curiosities, something we look at with interest, something we worry about, or how do we engage this?
Well, a couple of thoughts. I was thinking earlier, I was talking to a couple of the publishers here, IVP, which has played such a big role in sponsoring this. And it occurred to me, they have so many books on global Christianity, and I'd love to see a world where there are no books on global Christianity. And what I mean is, there are books on Christianity, and they just take account of everything that's in it. And if you think about it, I want to see the end of global Christianity until somebody can tell me what non-global Christianity is. You know, Christianity that doesn't apply to planet Earth? Christianity that only exists in one corner of the world? Please, no. Maybe the most important thing I would say, and this is a very serious comment, we today have a global church which is the first time ever in history that there ever has been a worldwide religion. Okay? There never has been before. I would like to see all our writing of history reflect that fact. And the degree to which what's happening today is not some freakish thing that happened as a result of globalization in the late 20th century, but it is Christianity getting back to normal. Christianity is a religion that is born in Africa and Asia, and in our time has decided to go home. For the first 1,500 years of its history, Christianity was a tricontinental religion, which at its height stretched from the Arctic Circle to the borders of Kenya, from the coast of Ireland to the coast of China. That's not global, but it's a very big deal. When we write the history of Christianity, okay, you have these maps on History Channel documentary, and they show Christianity spreading, and it reaches, Europe, reaches the United States, reaches Wheaton, Illinois, end of story. But what you get is the older areas, you see the lights going out, like in the Middle East. And they don't, or they don't for hundreds of years. From the 7th century to the 14th, most of the Muslim world is majority Christian. When the Christian crusaders strike Palestine and Syria, most of the people who suffer and die as a result of that are Christian, are local Christian. We can rewrite so much of the history of the last many centuries in terms of these Christian communities that are still there. We don't have to back project and make up things. They are there anyway. And when you actually do this, you get these kind of insights that are quite surprising. In many people talk about globalization. I know when globalization started. It started in 1578. Up till then, there'd been empires which had been over large sections of Africa and Asia and Europe. There'd never been a global empire. The first global empire started in 1578, when the Catholic Church established a diocese in Manila as an offshoot of the Archdiocese of Mexico City. That's when globalization started. And when you look at things like that, and you realize that when you look at the 16th, 17th, 18th century, the richest trade route in the world runs from Acapulco to Manila. And all the world's economic history has to be written in terms of that axis, which is also the world's largest missionary route. The point I'm saying is, when you look at global Christianity as a present reality and you back project it, you really do start to rewrite the history and rediscover maybe a lot of things you didn't see. But most important thing I want to see is, do not treat global Christianity as something off there that maybe we should look at. It needs to be fully integrated into our studies of the past and the present, and don't worry about the future, because it'll get you in the future. Yes?
Last question.
Please.
This is, again, a question then back to images, and thank you again for being here. But just a few years ago, I think about 15 or so, Wheaton took a significant step in removing an image from its brand, and that was the Crusader. And I'd be curious if there's another image in American evangelicalism today that you would suggest removing, what that would be. And for your reference, we're now the Thunder, so if that's a violent image, feel free to remove that.
Boy, I can think of many possible answers, some of which would get me thrown out of here so fast. Boy, I wish I could think of a better answer to that. I know one will strike me about 10 minutes after I leave the room. I suppose this isn't exactly, it doesn't exactly answer this, but I know next year this conference is going to be about the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, which is going to be a big event coming up. And I suppose what I'd like is something which is 1517 and Luther nailing things on the door, and 1518, the consecration of the first Congolese bishop in Rome. How's that for an interesting juxtaposition? I do hope you've got many panels on global Christianity at your conference next year. I'm going to draw to an end there. Thanks a lot.